In this video, we're going to do an introduction about access management, how we manage people accessing our devices or our servers or our phones or other items in our environment. The idea of access management is pretty much based off of the physical world as far as how you would manage access to physical environments such as military bases or bank vaults or other places that you would want to keep generally secure. Well, let's start off by talking about the most common item used in access management, which is called a TripleA server. TripleA server is based off of the name, off of the first letters of these items here: authentication, authorization, and accounting. Authentication should be pretty obvious. Well, you want to authenticate a user. Somebody comes into your environment and you authenticate them. You look at their identification. You use passwords. You use smart cards. You use some form of method to identify and authenticate the person is who they say they are. Once you've gone ahead and done authentication, you then start authorizing them. Okay, I know who you are. I have looked through your identification. You match who you say you should be. Your picture on your driver's license is who you say you are. Therefore, I'm authorizing you to access these resources. You can drive here. You can go to that location. You can do these types of activities. You're authorizing access to various resources. And then lastly is accounting. The first two are basically, hey, here's what you can do. The last one here, accounting, is kind of a monitoring aspect of what somebody actually did. I said that you could go play in the park, and the accounting portion is actually writing down whether somebody went to the park to play. And this is more for historical purposes of saying, hey, turns out that there was a big issue in the park yesterday. Maybe they had just sprayed some weed killer down and people are coming up sick, and therefore you go through the accounting of everybody who was in the park yesterday to be able to tell them, hey, you might be sick because of this weed killer. So it's kind of a historical record of what happened, so you can go back and review in the future. AAA servers. There's quite a few AAA servers out there that are in use. You normally don't see them as listed as AAA servers, but you may see like Active Directory or Windows AD is a form of a AAA server. Additionally, there is Radius and TACX Plus. You may not have heard of TACX Plus. It's a Cisco version of a AAA server. Radius is used a lot of times with wireless or dial-in VPN type solutions. And then there's additional ones. For instance, there is LDAP, which is a technology not specifically in a AAA system, but it has AAA features built in. And then there's additional AAA systems out there. The most common ones that you will run into in most environments are going to be these two right here, unless you're using some specific technology, such as LDAP, where in a unique environment where that's in use. All right, so that's how we authenticate. That's how we authorize people. That's how we take accounting. That's probably the very first step with regards to access management. Beyond that, we then have to define how we want to handle management, how we want to model our access. Do we want to just give everybody full control to everything? Do we want to restrict them down? At what layer, somewhere in between full access and no access, we have to grant them access? And there's normally a model we might want to give around that. The very first model is called a discretionary access control. Now, if you've been around the Windows environment very long, you may have seen references to DACLs, discretionary access control lists. And the key term there is discretionary, right there. Basically, I, at my discretion, can grant access to anybody, to any resource, to anybody. It's very quick. It's very easy to use. It's very open. The idea is that I want to share information, and therefore it is the least restrictive method of all of them. However, being the least restrictive also means it is the most vulnerable to malicious use. The opposite end of that spectrum would be the mandatory access control, which is mandatory. You have to follow these access controls, and that would be the most restrictive method out there. There's lots of different models here. If you are planning on taking a certification for security, definitely make sure you know a little bit about them, at least the key points. I kind of look at these as kind of like a military type thing. You always hear about the military. They have, top secret. And then down below, they have bottom secret. Yeah. Secret. And then somewhere in the middle secret. Yeah, I know they don't actually name them middle secret. But yeah, there's various classifications of secret, top secret, and I'm not sure where else they go. But the idea for Mac mandatory access control is all of the information, it has a label. And it's going to be like one of these labels. So you're going to label something as being top secret or secret or whatever layer of secrecy it has in it. So you define information or resources as having a certain layer or a certain label, and then you label people of having similar titles. So if I have top secret clearance, then I should be able to access everything that has a top secret label to it, in theory. So by the use of these labels, it helps identify what you can access and what you can't access. Another thing that's familiar or common to these is a similar idea, such as what's called write up and read down. So for instance, if I only have secret clearance or this middle clearance right here, but I have information that I need to report that should be considered top secret, I can go ahead and I can write up to top secret. Even though I only have the middle secret clearance, I can still write up into the top secret clearance, but I can't necessarily read it. I can report the information, and that is all. However, I can read what is below my secrecy level, both at my secrecy level as well as below. So write up, read down. If the way I always try to remember this is thinking about just a general person in the military, maybe somebody in the Air Force, and they see a UFO. Well, they can report the UFO. They can report it, and it goes up into the super top secret levels. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they can read the information that's in those super secret layers. They can report it, and that is all. So write up, read down. Some of these models, let's see, you get the Bell Padula, I think is how you say it. Biba, Clark Wilson, Chinese Wall. One of those actually has write up, read down as a definition. One of them is actually the opposite way around. It's read up, write down, but they flip the model around. Look into them, see exactly what they mean. And then lastly, so these are access control methods. The last one, role-based access control. We'll talk about that on the next slide. There are other access control models out there. There's rules-based access controls. So when certain rules are met, you have access. Rules might be like time of day, location, things like that. There's attribute-based access control. So if one of your attributes in your employee file is that you are part of accounting, then you get access to the accounting files. If it's one of the attributes is that you've taken a certain training, then you have access to whatever that training provides you. And then there's a lot of other attribute types. Other types of access controls. DAC, MAC, and RBAC are probably the three most common that you'll find out there. Role-based access control, probably one of the most common forms out there. Out of the three, DAC is the most least restrictive, MAC is the most restrictive, and then RBAC is pretty much the real world, how most of the world handles things. RBAC, role-based access control, basically you define a role. So you go around through your various organization and you define a roles. And so maybe you have a warehouse worker. however you spell warehouse. Warehouse worker whose job is to load inventory. Then you have maybe a front desk, IT, sales, accounting, and facilities. So you go around and you define all of these roles in your organization. Once you've defined all those roles, you identify the access that's needed for each of those roles. Well, how much access do the warehouse workers need? Well, okay, maybe they have a couple of computers in the warehouse that they have to use in order to track inventory, to print pick tickets, and so on. But they definitely don't need access to the front desk. You then have the front desk. Well, they need access to the front desk computer, but they don't need access to the sales or accounting systems. Sales, they need access to sales, but not to accounting, and so on and so forth. So once you've defined all that access, and that is not easy, you then have to create security profiles or groups for each of those roles. And this is the hard part with role-based access controls, is you have to go through and you have to identify all of these, and it is kind of an iterative process. If you think you're going to get it right on the first pass, you're fooling yourself. But you create these security profiles or groups, and then you assign people and the resources into those profiles, roles, groups, however you want to call them, and so that people who are in those groups can access those resources. For instance, I may create a warehouse computer group and a warehouse user group. And then I would grant the users access to those computers. You assign the people and the resources to those roles so that everybody who's a warehouse user, everybody who's in the warehouse user group can access the computers and applications and files that are in the warehouse computer group. And then you audit it regularly. So say somebody gets hired in as a warehouse worker. Awesome. They're doing really great. Turns out that there's a job at the front desk. So the warehouse worker moves into front desk. Well, you want to make sure that when they move into the front desk role, that not only are they granted access to the front desk role, but they're also removed from the warehouse role. That's the hard part. Let's say that this employee is really great and always is able to fill in wherever is needed. So for a couple of days, maybe they go off to sales. So they're moved into the sales role. And then maybe after a little while, they're moved into the accounting role. And so they moved over there and they have accounting access. And so this one user has moved along from various roles throughout the organization, and they can have what's called access creep. Basically, what access they have is just growing and growing and growing as they move around from role to role. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that a person is only ever in one role at a time. So when they're a warehouse worker, they only have access to the warehouse. When they're in sales, they only have access to sales. When they're in accounting, they only have access to accounting. So this regular auditing is really important to make sure that one person doesn't end up with more access than they should. A more realistic take on this may be if you've ever moved from house to house, condo to condo, apartment to apartment. When you moved, you probably or may have ended up with a key from the place you previously lived at. Now, why would you need a key to the place you used to live at? Honestly, you don't. But if you moved, you now have access to something you don't need access to, and therefore you kind of have a creep of access control. Well, if you keep moving from house to house, keep moving from apartment to apartment, you have more and more keys, and therefore you have more and more access, and therefore you end up with more access than you need to quite a degree. Imagine the janitor or the facilities guy who's walking around and he's got like 50 keys on his keychain. That's the kind of scenario we're talking about. Why would somebody in facilities need access to IT or accounting or sales, and this would be your job in IT to make sure that access is limited as appropriate. All right, well, let's talk about some best practices. Now, the first thing I'd like to mention when we're talking about best practices, the goal for access control is not necessarily to limit what people can do. The goal for access control is to give them the access that they need. It's a slightly different take on the idea, but the whole point is to allow people to do their jobs and then ultimately not get in trouble. So some best practices, some naming conventions. It's surprisingly simple to do a naming convention for users. For instance, sometimes it's first initial, and then last name. And for end users, that makes perfect sense. But then we have other types of users. For instance, we may have vendors or contractors that we have to deal with, and we may want to have a naming convention that specifically identifies this person as a vendor or a contractor, so that when we're doing our auditing process, we can go back and say, hey, this is a vendor. Are they still necessary? Additionally, one thing I've specifically found was with service accounts. Service accounts are oftentimes put in place into an environment and have a lot of access to systems, but then they're pretty much ignored from that point on, which makes them ripe for attackers to manage or to attack. So by having a naming convention specifically identifying this as a service account, my favorite example is just SVC underscore and then whatever the name of the service is. Then when you start seeing that service account logging into various resources, it's very easy to understand that's a service account. This is what it should be doing based off of its service title, and therefore shouldn't be logging into these other systems. So naming conventions, very, very helpful. Separation of duties. Not only separation of duties, but there's a couple other options such as mandatory vacations, and job rotation. Separation of duties. If you've ever worked in any kind of a financial area, you'll see that they have oftentimes accounts receivable and accounts payable. There's two different roles here. Basically, the accounts receivable is the person who receives things in. They receive the bills from vendors, and then they write them down in a ledger or a payment system or something along those lines. And then the accounts payable department are the ones that actually write the checks out to pay those vendors. By having two separate people to do two different roles, it stops one person from creating a fake invoice and then paying out that invoice. Similar example I've seen in the physical world, it has to do with banks. Banks have a vault, and that vault has a code onto it. Well, no one person should know the entire code to that bank vault. Oftentimes what they'll do is they'll have two different roles in the bank. One role will know the first half of the combo for the bank vault, and the other half will be known by another role in the bank. Therefore, no one person can open up the vault and take out all the money. And more specifically, if money goes disappearing, you can't blame anybody. Yeah. Therefore, if I only know half the code, there's no way I possibly could have gotten into the bank vault. Therefore, I could not have stolen out of it. So therefore, I have the access I need. I have half of the bank vault, and can still get in as long as I have the other half available to me, but I don't have so many permissions that I can get in trouble. Additionally, with that, mandatory vacations. This is oftentimes used in places where separation of duties isn't always available. I saw a story on TV a long time ago. Basically, somebody working at a hospital, they were responsible for ordering all of the drugs and medicines for the hospital. Well, they would go ahead and they would apparently were ordering more of some kinds of drugs than were necessary. Because their job was both to order and receive the packages, they were stealing the drugs. One day that person got sick and wasn't there to pick up the packages when they came in, and therefore somebody else reported, hey, we have a whole lot more of drug X than I thought we needed. Why do we have all this? And therefore they were able to find out that this person was stealing drugs from the hospital. So mandatory vacations is used in a lot of environments in order to enforce somebody to leave so that they can make sure that everything is working properly. This is very, very beneficial in a lot of areas. One, it makes people take vacations and keeps them from getting burnt out. And then two, it also just ensures that somebody else is there to be able to handle the roles, so that one person isn't responsible for the success or failure of the entire company. Additionally, job rotation, same kind of idea. There's more than one person able to do a job. You work the job for 6 months or a year, and then you rotate to another job where you are doing something else. Somebody else takes over what you were doing. It stops somebody from being able to build up an empire and have things only work one way, and helps cross-train your organization. External audits. External audits are very, very helpful. One, it helps make sure nothing bad is happening, and this occurs quite a bit in the financial realm. Make sure nothing bad is happening. Nobody's embezzling or doing anything bad. But then also it just helps to make sure that everything is working ideally. If somebody is coming in routinely, say every year, and looks through my environment and says, hey, yeah, you're meeting all the best practices, that's even better. I mean, that tells me that I'm doing my job great, and maybe they bring up some items that I can do better. Privilege of least, or the model of least privilege. Again, this is kind of hard. This is just like the role-based access controls. You have to go through, you have to identify what the roles are, and then provide the appropriate access for them, and then give the least amount of privileges to each user. Oh, sure, you have access to the whole building, but you only need access to the first floor. So it's least privileges of making sure people only have the access that they need. And that might just be the auditing that we were talking about previously with role-based access controls, of making sure that people are limited to the number of resources that they have. Again, it's not restricting what they can do, it's limiting what they can do to only what their job requires. And then lastly, procedures for onboarding, offboarding, and role changing of employees. Most companies I've ever worked at have had horrible procedures, if they had any procedures at all for this process. Onboarding employees, a lot of places I've seen is, hey, I just hired Joe, please give him the same access as I have. And that's really quick and easy, but it's not necessarily the ideal method. For instance, why does a frontline employee need the same access as a manager? There's probably access that the manager has that the frontline employee doesn't need. Additionally, for role change, again, this has to do with the auditing. If I'm going from accounting to HR, I don't need access to both accounting and HR systems at the same time. I need to make sure that when I role change, that those permissions are moved over and the old ones are removed. And then lastly, offboarding of employees. It would be not a new idea to think that somebody who leaves a company is going to be disgruntled about leaving that organization. Therefore, you would want to make sure that you are removing all the permissions that that user has, whether that's their Active Directory permissions, whether there's some web-based resources that they have access to. Maybe they are responsible for your Facebook feed for your organization. Maybe they are tying up or working with third-party organizations in order to order product for you. There's a lot of different things that employees might be doing, and you would want to have a process to make sure that when that person leaves, either voluntarily or not, that all of those resources are shut down properly. So there you have it, an introduction to access management, some of the best practices, some of the ways that it's run. There is definitely a whole lot more that you can get into with this, especially with some of the more specifics like the access models and so on. Hopefully this gets you going in the right direction for most of that.